Welcome, everyone. This is the fourth and final episode of the Okanagan Symphony Orchestra, Meet the Maestro. And today we're honored to have Julian Pellicano, who is our fourth candidate conductor. The first thing I'd like to do is start in a good way with the land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the Indigenous people of British Columbia, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and in the valley where we make and play music, the Syilx Okanagan people. We are grateful for this beautiful land, a living entity. Now I'll ask each of the panelists to give a brief introduction. Welcome, John, of course, musician with the symphony. John, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is John Suderman, and I have been a violinist in orchestras for 43 years. I have taught the art of playing the violin for all of these years. One of my greatest joys is to see students transition from taking violin lessons to having the violin becoming their passion in life. I've had the privilege of seeing this happen quite a few times now. And after all this time of playing and teaching, I still totally love and enjoy what I do.
Alexandra, if you could give us a brief introduction.
My name is Alexandra Poprosky. I live in Naramata, British Columbia in the Okanagan. So I've been a proud subscriber of the symphony for the 13 years that I have been here. I've also had the privilege of singing with the OSO chorus 3 or 4 times, and I was a board member from 2018 to 2020. Also a huge lover and supporter of the Youth Symphony Orchestra, musicians in our family, and love that I'm representing our little town with 447 seats at the Cleveland Theatre.
And speaking of the youth orchestra, of course, Zena is the youth orchestra conductor. And if you could introduce yourself as well, Zena.
My name is Zena Zayuna. I am, yes, the youth orchestra conductor in the Okanagan, an orchestral player myself, an oboist and a pianist. And I've studied education research and pedagogy. I studied in Denmark. I'm most interested in youth engagement, creative engagement. How does arts education and arts leadership support mental health and just the highest growth and transformation of our youth?
And I'm lucky enough to be Zena's piano student as well in my fun time. And the next person is fellow board member, Lisa. Can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Lisa Murray. I've been part of the board now for almost 2 years. I've been actively involved participating in various arts and cultural boards for over a decade. And this has been a great opportunity to actually see the talent of those clarinet players, because that was my childhood. My one sister played the clarinet and my other sister played the flute, and then a little bit of practice there on the piano, but nothing compared to what Alexis can offer. I'm really looking forward to this interview with Julian and learning more about you.
Hey, you could pick up that clarinet and we could play together. I'm Alexis Macmillan. I'm also one of the volunteer board members with the Okanagan Symphony Society, and it's really been a privilege to be able to host these Meet the Maestro episodes. And with that, Julian, can you tell us with a longer introduction about yourself?
I am currently based in Toronto, where I'm a conductor with the National Ballet of Canada. For the past 11 years, I was based in Winnipeg, where I was associate conductor of the Winnipeg Symphony and music director with Royal Winnipeg Ballet. I became a Canadian citizen about 2 years ago. I'm originally from the United States. I moved to Canada in 2013 when I started working with the Winnipeg Symphony. I brought with me my wife, who's a violinist, and my 3-year-old daughter, who was 3 at the time. We have another daughter who was born in Winnipeg, so she's a real Winnipegger. Yeah, very happy to be here living and working in Canada, and it's just such a wonderful country. We love being here, and a great musical country as well. My instrument is percussion. My background as a musician, I always had the feeling that it's quite different than a lot of my colleagues, in the sense that I was exposed to classical music and orchestral music quite late. I never played in a youth orchestra when I was young. I was primarily an autodidact, so I taught myself most as a percussionist, with the exception of playing in school. I started on the piano and then kind of quit piano lessons at 11 because maybe I was a bit too intrepid on my own and had a hard time learning from my teacher. But I also felt that I was interested in improvisation and composition and other things that my piano teacher wasn't into. So I just kind of went off on my own, which is why I'm not a great pianist like Zena is. But as a percussionist, I was kind of one of these kids that in school just played in everything you can play in. Like music was what I did. In my high school alone, I was playing principal percussion in the wind ensemble, principal in the concert band, principal in the orchestra, in the pit orchestra, captain of the drum line in our competitive marching band, and every other possible thing. I also played in 4 different bands outside of school. It's a testament to my incredible school music teachers that I am where I am today, because when I went to conservatory at age 18, to be honest, I still don't even know how I got in, because in my first year they said, you can play, but you're doing everything kind of backwards, you know? So a bit of an unusual background, but studied for a long time as a percussionist and was meant to be a timpani player. That's what I really wanted to do. And conducting is something that I kind of came into later. I'm not one of those conductors who saw a conductor when I was 10 and then suddenly I wanted to be a conductor, which is a very, very common story, like many of my colleagues. I was just interested in the big picture of music. Once I got to conservatory, I went to Peabody in undergrad as a percussionist, and I was very quickly exposed to music and composers that I had never really explored before, that I'd never heard before. And it just blew my mind. I'm very much indebted to my first timpani teacher at conservatory, who required us all to learn the entire repertoire from the scores. So we started with Haydn and we went through Stravinsky into the 20th century, learning timpani parts with the score. And that was my first exposure to the conductor's score. So I just became very interested in what everyone else was doing all the time, because I felt like this is the thing that's going to make me a better timpani player. And eventually started to organize some projects on my own of percussion music that I wanted to conduct. I did my master's at Yale School of Music. In my first year as a percussion student, I was offered a conducting assistantship and started conducting a lot. And very quickly realized, like being up on the podium, that I think this is where I belong. And at that time, I was 25, 26 years old. I was getting ready to take professional timpani auditions, but I just kind of changed careers and decided to study conducting more. I finished a percussion degree, auditioned for the Yale School of Music conducting program, which is fairly competitive, and was able to get a spot. And so I did 2 masters at Yale. I spent 4 years there, one master's as a percussionist and 2 more years as a conductor. This is a bit of my sort of musical background. It has a lot of twists and turns, definitely not a straight path, and it's a bit of an unusual path. I've learned to embrace it and try to see, are there things about my background that help me on the podium? That's a bit of my musical background. On a personal level, like I said, I have a family. I have 2 daughters, my wife, who's also a musician. My parents were immigrants from Italy in the 1950s, so I spent a lot of time as a kid going back to Italy, and my Italian is not perfect, but I love speaking Italian when I get the chance.
Fantastic. And thank you for that introduction. It's always interesting to hear the path that people take to get to where they are. And I don't know, are many percussionists conductors? A lot of string players I've seen and horn players, but is this a common thing?
I would say it's not that common, but there's a small group, I suppose, of percussionists working as symphonic conductors.
And speaking of musicians and teachers, John, I'm going to pass the first question to you.
There's a lot of competition for the entertainment dollar in the Okanagan, as there is everywhere else. I'm wondering what your vision is for making the OSO become a premier choice of a musical event that people would want to go to. How do we make a concert become more of a big event for the public to want to come in larger numbers?
It's hard to just have a silver bullet for creating events, right? There are events that orchestras produce that are more in the popular culture sphere that become big events. As I travel around North America conducting many, many films live with orchestra, these productions usually feel like events, but only because they're just so utterly popular. People just know these blockbuster films, and so they come out in droves and they're completely sold out. But they have attached to them this massive pop culture cachet. Of course, orchestral music and classical music doesn't. We're not just competing at the moment with other entertainment options, we're also competing with all entertainment ever produced in the history of recorded audio and video at the moment, because you can basically stream or find anything on your computer. So one of the things that a lot of orchestras can do better or can do differently, the experience of coming to an orchestra, we have a traditional environment. You enter the hall and then you go into the theater, and then, maybe there's a pre-concert talk, and then you go in and then the conductor comes out and they play, and then, etc. Most people are not familiar with this at all. If they're a newcomer to the symphony, a first-time symphony goer, I think all orchestras need to be more newcomer focused, with the understanding that all of our signaling, all of our advertising, everything that is on our website needs to be dedicated towards people who really have never walked in the door before. My experience as a conductor, I can tell you, in Winnipeg, in 11 years, I conducted hundreds and hundreds of concerts. I had a lot of opportunity to meet people in the community and people who love music. So the experience of coming to the hall, redefining this whole experience. How do people feel when they come in? Are there people in the lobby to greet them? Some of these things seem pedantic to us. They seem very unartistic, but they're really important. How is the bar situation? Am I going to have time to socialize and to see people? Am I going to learn something? Is somebody going to talk to me about the music? Like, I have no idea what I'm hearing. Is someone going to come out and tell me something? Going to an orchestra should be as similar as possible, I think, sometimes to going to a hockey game, in the sense that when I was living in Winnipeg and I go to a Jets game, you show up an hour early because you can have a drink, there's plenty of restaurants, there's things to do, there's a lot of activity, and people know that. And every game becomes an event. Sometimes I think we need, as orchestras, to deconstruct the entire experience and get away from what we learned in music school, get away from what it probably is like at the Vienna Philharmonic, which is like what we sometimes have in our mind, and go back to our own communities and find out what would be super comfortable for people here, for people in the Okanagan Valley, to come to a concert to make it feel like a real experience.
Thank you. Alexandra, I think these are questions that you've thought about many times too, being a past board member, a sponsor, a subscriber, and just general supporter of the OSO. Alexandra, do you have a question?
I do. Just going to say to Julian, tell us what you do for joy outside of your work. So hobbies and other interests.
I try to spend a lot of time with my kids because I'm on the road quite a bit. I try to spend time with them and just have a lot of fun, and kind of try to take them to different parks and different places and explore different areas of town. But as a hobby, I try to keep myself, well, as fit as possible. I couldn't say I'm in great shape, but by playing squash. So that's like kind of my sport of choice. As a hobby, I love to fish. Usually when I go back to New York, I'll fish the South Shore of Long Island, which is excellent surf casting into the ocean. And then when I was in Manitoba in Western Ontario, going out and fishing Lake of the Woods and parts north. Fishing, I find, it's about catching fish, but it's also about being out in nature. That's one of the things that really is very restorative to me. I think as a conductor, you spend a lot of time in a room by yourself with your scores and maybe a piano, or you spend a lot of time on a plane in airports. That's what I've been finding over the past 5 or 6 years. And so to have a moment where you can really turn it off, which I admittedly have a difficult time doing, it's hard for me. But when you're out on the lake or you're on the ocean, there's nothing else to do. I've learned over time that is the best way to make music, is to actually have a break at some moment.
Zena, a question for you before your question is, are oboists a common conductor in the symphony world?
I know more percussionists who are conductors than oboists. My draw towards conducting is really about the engagement with youth and just helping them have that transformational experience that I did. So yes, I would say mostly oboe players are pretty comfortable in their own chairs.
And Zena, what is your question for Julian?
What is one piece of advice that you received from a mentor that has had a lasting impact on you as a musician and a conductor?
Well, it's so hard because I feel like I'm so indebted to all my teachers, and they gave me so much advice to try and narrow it down. Well, I'll tell you two pieces of advice because it would be hard for me to pick one. Probably my most important musical mentor was my percussion teacher at Yale. His name is Robert Van Cise. He was far more than a teacher to all of us who have studied with him. Really, truly a mentor for our entire lives and also as players. I still call him to this day for advice about my conducting career, to be honest. From a musical side, he would always say to us that the truth of anything that we're playing is just in the sound. And I think what he meant by that is that, you know, when you're a musician, especially when you're young, but even as you become more experienced, it's very easy to just get in your head about what you're doing. And we have a lot of self consciousness about ourselves as musicians because you're trying to communicate something that's a part of yourself out in the world. And there is also a kind of complex of competitiveness in the music world, which I don't always love, but it's out there, right? And so we're simultaneously trying to be vulnerable as musicians and also stacking ourselves up against other musicians who are who are out in the world, whether professionally or we're students. But this one comment that the truth of it is in the sound always brought us back to just focus on the actual sound. And I often have to find myself remembering that as a conductor because, as you know, you're conducting an orchestra, you're thinking about so many different things, especially when you're traveling and often you're meeting new orchestras that you've never met before. You're standing there thinking about every possible thing that they could be thinking or what could go wrong and then but if you just remember to focus on the sound, actually everything takes care of itself. The other piece of advice that was really important for me in 2009, I was at the Kurt Masur Masterclass in New York. And I just remember a moment conducting the orchestra in that masterclass when I realized that as a conductor, like you have to just conduct only what you believe in. It's impossible to conduct somebody else's interpretation the same way it's impossible to play someone else's interpretation if you're a soloist or whatever it is that you're doing. That moment was very important for me as a conductor. I've been able to find a way to sort of round that out in saying that in applying that also to my colleagues on the stage conducting wise, that sometimes as an orchestra player, especially if you're a soloist in principal wind or concertmaster, sometimes you're in a rehearsal, and I've been there before as a percussionist because I played in orchestras. You're in a rehearsal with a conductor who's trying to strong arm an interpretation upon the orchestra, which is just not how the orchestra plays. It's just not their concept of music. And I've found many times as a conductor that it's better sometimes to listen to what everyone brings to the table and sort of say to yourself that today this is going to be our interpretation. And there are many, many musical versions of a piece that are totally valid and really wonderful. And sometimes you stumble upon a version of it that you never thought of if you just let people play.
Lisa, do you have a question?
With the autodidact experiences that you've had, kind of learning backwards, as you put it, could you give us an example of a situation where you've been able to use those learnings for others within the orchestra?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's an interesting question. I wonder. Now you make me wonder how have I used being having taught myself for many years. I can say that I think it's made me very open-minded to a lot of different possibilities. From about the age of 13 to 18, I spent most of my time trying to playing improvised music and also composing as well. I gave up composing actually because when I got to conservatory, I thought, oh wow, these are real composers here. I should just quit. You know, in a way, it was an experiment, but it really composing music and improvising music, I think, has allowed me to sort of embrace many situations as a conductor. I feel very, very comfortable to conduct in all different kinds of concerts. I've worked with many pop artists. as well as classical soloists. I've on occasion had to compose connecting music from one piece to another. There's one part of our program where I've done that as well. Or creating arrangements for the orchestra where there's a piece of music we want to play, but it doesn't exactly exist in the exact format we need it. I sometimes feel like I'm improvising myself as a musician and just sort of going with the flow of what comes over my desk and feeling like, yes, this is great music. Absolutely, I will conduct it. So I've done everything from, concerts with the Bare Naked Ladies to doing, E.T. live in concert or Harry Potter 5 live in concert to writing and producing concerts for children and for schools. I've written, several education concerts that were attended by 20,000 Winnipeg students each year, and getting up and talking about music and sort of just trying to have a little bit of fun. I often think that fun is kind of underrated in our world.
Speaking of programs, I'd like to talk a little bit about the upcoming program in April. And for our listeners, the Mendelssohn and Chopin concert will be Friday, April 4th in Kelowna, Saturday, April 5th in Penticton, and Sunday, April 6th in Vernon. One of the things we've done in programming over this year in particular is to try to sprinkle in something a little bit different into each program. So that's where you see the music from Bridgerton coming into this one. So we're hoping that that draws in some new audience members, speaking of how we do that, along with learning more about some of the other classical pieces that are being played. Julian, would you tell us what excites you about this program and maybe just a little bit briefly about each part?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a very eclectic program. I really enjoy a program where all the pieces are connected and there's some sort of historical, some kind of connections, or whether it be artistic connections. This is interesting for sure. But to be honest, sometimes it's just cool to have a program with many different pieces that are all, have their own character and there's not necessarily a through line. And I think this program definitely has that in it. It has a lot of contrast, which I like. I think it's a great idea to put pieces together that are the opposite of each other. Compare them on a program. It's just interesting and fun for the ears, right? We start off with the First Symphony by Joseph Boulogne, one of his lesser known symphonies. The symphony of his that people are playing very often these days is the Symphony Number 2. We're going to be playing Symphony Number 1. Joseph Boulogne, of course, has a very interesting background. He's one of the very few Black composers in the 18th century, was a contemporary of Mozart and Haydn, working in Paris. Many audience members may have seen the biopic that recently came out about him called Chevalier. And the music is absolutely indicative of music of that period that was being composed all over Europe, and is just a truly remarkable example of it. He himself led, a really quite extraordinary life, both as a musician and as a fencer, and he was involved in the Parisian courts and rose to quite a fame as not only a violin soloist, but also as a composer and as a conductor of sorts. Conducting was a little bit in its infancy at that moment, but leading orchestras for sure. And so an important figure in 18th century music who is now becoming more and more rediscovered by orchestras, and it's absolutely fantastic music. I'm very, very excited to perform with a legendary Canadian pianist, Janina Fielkowska, for the first Chopin concerto. I mean, if she's known maybe for anything, it's playing Chopin, but of course she's a wonderful pianist in any repertoire. And so to be able to share the stage with her is an honor. And of course, in the Chopin first concerto, it's an absolute masterpiece. Audiences love this music. To hear Janina play it, I think will be an absolute treat for the audience and also for myself and the orchestra, because she's just a stunning pianist and an absolute legend. And then on the second half of our program, as you mentioned, we have some music. I'm sure that everybody is familiar with Bridgerton. I have to say, I didn't watch a lot of Bridgerton before I knew I was conducting music from Bridgerton, but I did watch some of it. I don't watch a lot of shows, so I could not make my way through all however many seasons there are of it. I'm really sorry. That would have been like 35 hours of watching, which I didn't have. But it's It's very entertaining, and the music is really cool. I mean, it's pop music that has been arranged in a kind of classical manner for string quartet, and we're going to be playing with string orchestra. We have three songs by Madonna, by Alanis Morissette, and Taylor Swift. And as we had the three separate arrangements, I felt that, after a little bit of time looking at them and working with them and sort of imagining how they fit into this concert and what is the best way to present them, I felt that having three separate arrangements maybe just interrupted the flow of the moment of what we were trying to achieve. And so I had this idea to write some connecting music that instead of creating three different pieces, it's actually like a suite. And so the three songs will go from one to another in a seamless fashion. And I'm almost positive that the audience will be able to pick up where one ends and where the other one begins. So that will be really cool. And then the Mendelssohn Fourth Symphony, which is known as his Italian Symphony. It couldn't have been a more perfect piece because this is one of my favorite symphonies of all time. From the very first time that I heard it when I was a conservatory student, I just absolutely fell in love with it. It has an incredible timpani part as well, which is probably the reason why I first fell in love with it. But also, it's just this incredible characteristic piece. The history of it is amazing. I mean, Mendelssohn went on this grand tour, as many young, fairly well-to-do young men would have done at that time in the 1820s. He traveled all over Europe. He went to Scotland, and then eventually he made his way to Italy, where he met Hector Berlioz, and he wrote this symphony while he was there. And I always thought it was so interesting that Mendelssohn really thought of it as four vignettes of his time in Italy. The first movement is meant to depict in some kind of musical way. I mean, it's not so specific. It's not like a tone poem by Strauss where you hear the story play out in music, but it's like the rolling hills and the sun and the beauty of the whole place, just getting to Italy. And then the second movement is like it's an actual funeral procession that he witnessed in Naples. He went as far south as Naples, which I find fascinating because it must have been very wild at that time. And so it has this processional sort of feeling to it that would have felt very foreign to him as somebody living in Germany. The third movement is this sort of elegant dance with horns in the distance. And then the fourth movement, which is the movement that really hit me when I was a young musician, it's supposed to be the chaos of Rome. And if you go to Rome today, it's still chaotic. So I love the fact that in the 1820s it was chaotic, and it's still chaos when you go to Rome. I also find it interesting that Berlioz, who was actually born in the same year as Mendelssohn, went to Rome and he wrote an opera called Benvenuto Cellini that takes place in Rome. And there's a part of that opera that we often play in the orchestra called the Roman Carnival Overture. That overture was supposed to depict the chaos of the carnival in Rome, so Mardi Gras. Mendelssohn basically had the same experience. So yeah, it's as I mentioned, a very eclectic program, all great music with a wonderful soloist. I'm very, very excited to come and perform it with the musicians in the Okanagan Symphony.
What would you like the people of the Okanagan to know about you or about this program or about you as a candidate conductor potentially coming here?
I'm just really honored to be a part of the finals. To be asked to potentially lead any orchestra like the Okanagan Symphony, a professional orchestra here in Canada, is just it's a very big job. It's a lot of responsibility for any conductor who's leading a symphony orchestra. That is a part of the job of being a conductor that I take very seriously. There's a serious dedication that we all have to have as musicians to our audience. There's a serious dedication that we have to have to our community, especially in smaller cities like Kelowna. And it's not Toronto, it's not New York, it's different. The work of the Okanagan Symphony and the music director has to be very custom tailored to that community. And so being a part of the community and getting out and meeting people and doing everything we possibly can to custom tailor what we're presenting to the people in our area is very important to me. Mainly, I'm very, very honored that I'm invited, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting the musicians, but also meeting the audience, as many people as possible.
And those audience members will be from Kelowna, Vernon, Penticton, and Naramata, as Alexandra will tell you, and many other smaller communities around these three centers. So we're very excited to have you come here today. And I just want to thank you very much, Julian, for taking the time so that we could get to know you a little bit before April. I encourage everyone to come out and meet Julian.
Lovely to meet you and lovely to be with all of you today. What a treat.
Thank you so much, Julian. It was really nice to meet you in person, and I look forward to connecting with you again.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Julian, and look forward to seeing you in April.
Thanks. Same to you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. It's such a pleasure to meet and to have these kind of discussions, and look forward to April when we can all get together in person.
Fabulous.
Yeah.